In early spring, I built my first garden bed and sowed directly several greens like arugula and Swiss chard. While everything germinated reliably, the Swiss chard came up a bit more spotty. As I half expected, the Swiss chard germination is kind of spotty. That's the one thing I don't like about Swiss chard, and one thing I don't like about direct seeding. You never know what you get, especially because Swiss chard, like beets, they are a compound seed with many seeds in the same pod. So you get many times a clump of several plants together, and then others that just don't germinate because it's a hard seed to germinate. Unfortunately, it doesn't respond too well to the plate germination either, and it doesn't like to be transplanted. So you do have to thin if you're trying to get the largest leaves, and you have to overplant. But I'm gonna leave it as is, and I know that I'll still get a decent harvest, because the one good thing about Swiss chard is that it is very resilient. It will produce a lot of greens throughout the summer, unlike many other plants, and it doesn't really bolt, because as far as I know, it's a biennial, so it would only bolt in the second year. So it's a plant that can produce a lot, but at the same time, you're at the mercy of its germination. The hardest thing about growing Swiss chard is to get it to germinate reliably. If you start with very fresh seed, you will have a greater chance of successful germination. The seeds are known to be viable from 2 to 5 years if kept in perfect conditions. They like soil temperatures to be in the 60 to 65 Fahrenheit range to germinate. Soils that are colder than 50 degrees Fahrenheit can severely impact germination. They will generally sprout in 5 to 7 days under good conditions, but can take up to 3 weeks, which can lead to spotty, uneven emerging. Perhaps soaking the seeds for some hours before planting them in the ground may increase the germination rate, but I haven't tested to know from experience. It is directly related to beets, and you may have noticed the resemblance on the leaves and the bright colors it can come in. This means that, like other root vegetables, it is best to plant them directly where they are intended to grow. Of course, you can start them in cups if you're careful to transplant them without damaging the root ball. When sowing Swiss chard, space them about 1 inch apart, depositing them in furrows that are about ½ inch deep. If you get lots of germination, you will have to thin the plants so that they are at least 6 to 8 inches apart. Because not all of my seeds germinated, the ones that did happened to be spaced far enough apart that didn't really need thinning. If you have to thin, you can do what I like to call harvest thinning. That is, you can harvest your young plantlets to use in salads. After about 2 months, my leaves had grown large enough for real harvest. I'm doing my first harvest of the Swiss chard, and the leaves look luscious. They have grown beautifully despite the fact that the germination was spotty. At least the ones that did grow, they kind of grew spaced out, and the clumps that had more than one, I just let them grow because there was enough space for them to develop without having to thin. That's the strategy I'll continue having. I know that if you space them out a little bit farther, they could develop larger leaves and probably longer stems. And the stems are a desirable part of the plant. They, especially in this variety here that I got, a group of several colors, the rainbow Swiss chard as it's marketed, I think it's good to have longer stems that you can actually use the stems for plating a beautiful plate. So I'll start harvesting them, but just the beauty of the luscious leaves with the dew almost makes me want to just let them be there. They're highly ornamental if you think about it. They could almost stand by their own in the midst of a ornamental bed, especially the colorful type like these. But in any case, I do have to protect it inside of these cages because, again, it's a groundhog favorite. So now I get to eat it, fortunately, because of the protection of this cage. While you can eat young Swiss chard raw in moderation, I prefer to cook it. It can be a bit soapy when raw, and much like spinach, they are high in oxalic acid. It is not my go-to dark green like kale, but it can be delicious. If you destem it and cook the leaves, they taste a lot like spinach. They grow best when the temperatures are in the 60s, so they are in fact a cool weather crop. But unlike other cool weather crops like spinach that bolt as summer approaches, Swiss chard still grows well throughout the summer. It is a low maintenance green. Mulching it with grass clippings and watering it only in cases of dry spells seem to be all the maintenance necessary to have them flourish. One of the things I enjoy the most about Swiss chard is how reliable a producer it is. Once you get it established, it's sort of maintenance free, at least in the area I am, where it does rain frequently. It will not really get any serious pest damage. You can see that there are some holes in a few leaves here. It's probably from grasshoppers or other leaf-eating generalists, but they don't succumb to disease. At least I haven't seen it in my garden. And they produce a harvest from the beginning of spring, when they start producing reliably, up until November, sometimes even December, because they're biannual, so they don't bolt in the first year. They do not put out flowers. That way they put all their energy into producing beautiful leaves. And the more you fertilize with a nitrogen-rich fertilizer, the more leaves they'll grow. Since I'm using grass clippings, it seems to be working pretty well in terms of getting the nutrition they need. They've perked up in the last weeks when I've applied more, and you can see by the center leaves, the young leaves, how luscious and plump they look. They just need to stretch out and they'll be huge leaves like the ones that are appearing. Overall, it's a success, a huge success. I'll be back right after this commercial. Growing vegetables at home is more than just raising produce. We should encourage ecological havens, promoting beneficial critters like spiders that can actually help us with pest issues. I was happy to see the spider taking up residence, hauling around its sack of eggs. Hopefully it would keep in check some of the insects that may have attacked my greens. One of the things I enjoy the most about gardening is using seasonal produce. Before supermarket shelves became providers of almost any imaginable vegetable at any time of the year, people were forced to adapt to seasonal eating. While it can be convenient eating tomatoes in winter, we do lose some of the magic of waiting for the right time for vegetables to be available. There is nothing quite as tasty as summer-grown tomato or the first fresh asparagus of spring. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy having options to eat fresh produce year-round, especially during winter when all our options back in the day would have been cabbage and onions. But harvesting garden fresh produce like young Swiss chard beats store-bought anytime. Of course, but growing a plethora of greens is not always easy. I was having trouble keeping a constant supply of arugula growing without any issue. The arugula there has run its course. I've cut it, it's starting to come back again, but I don't think it's going to be a very viable solution. This one is looking much better, except for the fact that it has little holes from the flea beetles. My hope is that flea beetles, they won't stick around for much longer. In my experience, they have a short period of the year around May, start of June, where they eat everything they like, but then they leave and the plants are able to regain their growth. For that reason, I'm not going to do anything other than actually sow more arugula over there. The best thing is that, well, groundhogs are not eating it, and that's a huge thing. That means I can grow a green outside without being bothered by groundhogs. To ensure a continuous harvest of mixed greens, some plants like Swiss chard you plant only once a year. Take care of it and harvest it until the following year. Other short-lived plants like arugula need to be planted in batches every 2 weeks or so, since they tend to run to seed fast during the summer, as longer days signal the plant to flower, set seed, and die within some weeks. These flea beetles were destroying my harvest because soon these arugula leaves would would be flowering before new leaves could have a chance to form. Flea beetles were not much of a problem in my old garden, when it came to arugula especially. Perhaps I had a better community of beneficial insects that kept pests at bay. In time, I would find out if this would be a reoccurring headache for me in this new place, or if eventually the problem would solve itself by increasing diversity in the garden. Eventually, I would learn.